consciousness doesn't arise out of space, time, matter, energy. It's the opposite. What we take to be the physical world, what we take to be it, I'm not saying the actual physical world, is all in consciousness. So consciousness does not arise out of the world, the physical world. Our experience of the physical world arises in consciousness.
All right, I'm joined here with our third and final speaker today, Peter Russell. So Peter studied theoretical physics, experimental psychology, and computer science at the University of Cambridge, where he was a student of Stephen Hawking. He then went to India to study meditation and Eastern philosophy, and on his return conducted research on the psychology of meditation. A leading thinker on consciousness and contemporary spirituality, he coined the term global brain with his 1980s bestseller of the same name, in which he predicted the internet and the impact it would have on humanity. His other books include The Awakening Earth, Waking Up in Time, From Science to God, and most recently, Letting Go of Nothing. Peter is a fellow of the World Business Academy, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Findhorn Foundation, and an honorary member of the Club of Budapest. His work has received critical acclaim from the likes of Anita Roddick of The Body Shop, Ted Turner of CNN, and Eckhart Tolle. You can learn more by visiting www.peterrussell.com. So, Peter, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you with us here today, and I want to wish you the best of luck with your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'm really pleased to be here with you all. And my presentation, as you've probably seen from the program, is on basically non-duality and the science of consciousness. Can the two actually fit together? So what I'd like to start doing, first of all, is just look at what do we mean by non-duality, because I think there's a lot of common misunderstanding. It's a word that's really come into common usage probably the last 10 years or so. And people sometimes think it means oneness. But non-duality, the term non-duality comes from the Sanskrit advaita. It comes from advaita teachings, and advaita is actually directly translated as non-dual, as not two. If they'd meant oneness, they'd have said oneness, but they actually say not two, and I'll get into what that actually means. But the oneness thing, people think, oh, non-duality means we're all one human race, we're all interconnected, or we've got to see through differences of race or gender, those sorts of things. And that's all important. That's all valuable stuff. But actually, the origin of the term, the advaita term, comes from the Upanishads, and that's where it's really first introduced. And there's one story there which I really like, which is of this person who's a teacher. He sent his son off to school, and the son comes back very proud. He spent years there. He's learned everything. And his father says to him, well, did they teach you about that, which knows the unknowable? And he said, what do you mean? And he said, and then the teacher goes into a whole series of examples. And the one that I really like best, he says, you see these two pots, these two clay pots, right? That they are different. They are different shapes. They are certainly different pots, meaning there is duality. There is difference. These pots are different. They're unique. And they are all made of clay. They all have the same essence. And this is what it points out, is that the clay isn't changed by becoming a pot. The clay doesn't take on potness. The clay remains clay. The essence always remains the same. It's the form, if you like, that the essence takes on that is different. And so what he's really saying is there is duality, the different pots, and there is an underlying essence, in this case, the clay. And he ends up each of these teachings with saying, that essence is the essence of you, is the essence of everything. And each of these teachings ends in Sanskrit with the phrase tat tvam asi, which is usually translated as that art thou. You probably heard the term tat tvam asi. It means that art thou. That's the way it's usually translated. But we could say more simply, just you are that. You are that essence. You are that unchanging essence, as well as all these different forms and all the different modes of consciousness we get into. You are still that unchanging essence. And the sort of challenge with that is, if that is true, why don't we see consciousness in everything? If the essence of everything is consciousness, and that's what he's really pointing towards, if that is the essence, or our own inner essence is the essence of everything, why don't we see that? Because what we see is a very real material world. We don't see consciousness in everything. So that's sort of some very basic summary of what non-duality means. On the other side, the science of consciousness. How does science look at consciousness? Or how, the worldview of science is strictly a physical one. It's the worldview of what's often called space, time, matter, energy. That is seen to be the fundamentals. Although, the more we get into it, we don't really know what space is, or time, or matter, or energy. But we assume that they are manifestations of some deeper physical reality. But consciousness is not part of that at all. So we've got one worldview that says consciousness is the essence of everything, and another one that says, sorry, the physical world is the essence of everything, and consciousness somehow arises out of it. So the challenge is, how do we reconcile those two very different views? And again, there's challenges for the scientific worldview of consciousness, which is really how does consciousness arise? If the world is physical, why are we conscious in the first place? What's going on here? And what is usually assumed in the physical worldview is that consciousness somehow arises out of the brain. And there's been lots of different approaches to understanding how does consciousness arise out of the brain. And what people miss is there's really two questions here. There's, how does the brain give rise to what we actually experience? Like if I'm seeing a tree out my window, that experience of the tree, how does that arise in consciousness? Or if I'm solving a mathematical problem in my brain, how does that come into consciousness? Or whatever it is I'm thinking, how does that come into consciousness? So that's one of the questions. The other question is, why is there consciousness in the first place? And many people who explore the whole sort of how does consciousness arise from the brain confuse these two questions. And it certainly seems true from what we know of the brain that maybe one day we will understand exactly what happens when I'm seeing a tree, or when I'm solving a problem, or thinking, having a certain emotion, or whatever. Maybe we will understand that. And that's what David Chalmers, philosopher of this whole era, he called that the easy problem of consciousness. It's not at all easy. Maybe in 100 years, whatever, we will understand the brain well enough to actually know what happens when we have a certain experience or a certain thought. That's the easy question, he says. The hard question, he calls this the hard problem of consciousness, is why is there consciousness in the first place? I mean, how does, as he put it, how does the material world of space, time, matter, energy, which we assume to be unconscious, how does that give rise to consciousness, which is totally immaterial? That's the hard problem. And I say people often confuse the two, and they think because the brain produces this or that experience, it produces consciousness. But there are actually two very different issues here. So let me just pause a minute and say, what do we mean by consciousness? Because we use the word in many different ways. I mean, we may say, in the daytime, I'm conscious. When I'm asleep, I'm unconscious. But we're not, because, when we're asleep, we're dreaming. And dreamings are experiences in consciousness. Or we talk about people having maybe, a particular social or political consciousness, which is like their values of how they see the world. Or someone who say, I wasn't really conscious when I said that, meaning I didn't do that deliberately. It was like just something expressed itself. Or I know one of them, we get home, we've driven home sometimes that, I do this under the drive home, and my mind's been elsewhere. And I might say, well, somehow I got here without actually remembering the route. I didn't remember the experience of driving, but clearly I was conscious, or I'd have driven straight into a tree. So these are some of the ways we use consciousness today. Or one which, I rather decry is like, that's a conscious person, meaning that is a spiritual person, a very conscious person. I mean, we're all conscious to that extent. So that's one use of sort of consciousness. The other use, which I'm much more interested in, is the whole phenomenon of being aware, of actually being aware in the first place. And we call that consciousness or awareness, but it's deceptive. The very word is deceptive. I mean, consciousness is a noun. And when you add N-E-S-S to any adjective, you're basically taking that quality and turning it into a noun in order to talk about it. So, we might, happiness is the quality, the state or quality of being happy. And that's what ness, if you look up ness in the dictionary, it's a state or quality of something. Or, softness is a quality, it's the state or quality of being soft. But happiness doesn't exist in a sense. The experience of being happy exists. The experience of touching something soft exists. But the happiness is really an abstract noun which allows us to talk about something. But it's not actually a thing. It's an experience. So is softness, it's an experience. And it's the same with consciousness. And this is where I think a lot of times people studying the science of consciousness get misled. Because it's a noun, they start looking for this thing called consciousness. But what it really means, if you look at the root meaning, is it's the state or quality of being conscious, of being aware. It's not actually a thing, but it's that quality of being aware. And because so it's recognizing that one thing which we probably all know for sure is that we are aware. I mean, every one of us right now is aware. Whatever we're aware of, whatever's going on, we are aware. It's the one thing that never changes, the fact that we are aware. But it's not a thing. In a way, I think this is what Descartes was pointing to when he said, I think, therefore I am. He was looking for absolute truth. And he did this whole process of what is it he couldn't doubt? And he doubted almost every experience he had. He went through this process of doubting everything. And then finally came to the realization that what he couldn't doubt was the fact that he was thinking about all these different things. He couldn't doubt that. And therefore, he couldn't doubt that he existed. As he said, therefore I am, or we might say, therefore the I is. Therefore I am aware is the fundamental truth. And I think that's what consciousness refers to, is the fundamental essence of our being, that we are always aware. Whatever it is we're aware of, we're always basically aware. So that's the way I should be using consciousness, not as a particular form or something of consciousness, but the fact that underneath everything, we are aware. Or I sometimes like to think of it more as a verb. It's not that I am aware, which also gets into problems we'll touch on a bit later, but there is a wearing. There is a wearing going on. That is really the truth. There is a wearing, and then experiences arise in that awaring. Coming back to the basic question, how do we reconcile, the scientific approach to consciousness, which basically says, this is not part of the world. It's something that arises out of the brain in some way. Somehow this awaring arises out of the brain in ways we have no idea how that happens. How do we reconcile that, which says that, consciousness doesn't exist as such in the world, only in ourselves, with the non-dual position, which says, consciousness is absolutely fundamental, the fundamental essence of everything. I think science actually points to the resolution, but as we shall see, it doesn't really explore the full implications of what it's pointing to. And the aspect of science I'm thinking about here is basically neurology, neurophysiology, the understanding of the brain and how experience arises. how does perception actually arise in the brain? So as a fact, it doesn't understand fully how it happens, but this comes back to, the easy problem of consciousness, that basically the brain is creating for us a perception of the world. So when I'm looking at the tree, I see the color green, for example. I see a green leaf. And what is happening here is light of a certain frequency. The light itself isn't green, it's just light. We just call it a certain frequency of light. Light of a certain frequency reaches the eye, triggers off various receptors, particularly the green ones in the eye, and that sends messages back to the brain, but the messages aren't green messages to the brain, they're just electrical impulses traveling down nerve fibers. And the brain then analyzes what it's seeing, puts it all together, and creates the experience of greenness for us in our consciousness. But there's nothing green about any of this until the experience arises in consciousness, and then that's where the greenness happens. So when I see a tree or anything I see, basically the brain is analyzing all the data and putting it all together into this particular experience. And it's not just vision. I mean, the same happens with all the other senses, with sound, for example. If you hear sound, music, or sound of my voice, there's vibrations in the air, and those vibrations are touching little hair follicles in my ears, which send messages back to the brain. And the brain, I mean, it's amazing, absolutely amazing what the brain does, particularly with sound. It then takes all that information, analyzes it. If you're listening to a piece of music, it sorts out the violins from the bass or the trumpets, analyzes all that, puts it all together in this incredibly sophisticated way, and we listen to music there, or the sound of my voice, or the bird song. It's all being created, in a sense, by the brain. The actual physical world, you could say that there is no sound. There's air moving, there's air molecules vibrating, and that vibration reaching our ears. But what we call sound, and same with taste, smell, any of the senses, is actually a representation of what is out there arising in our mind. So none of this actually exists until it gets to the mind. And again, another thing which I think most of us are aware of is the way we see or hear the world is just our particular human way of seeing it. A dog, for example, doesn't see red. It only has two color receptors, blue and yellow. And so its world it's a lot more brownish than ours. It doesn't see red. Or take a bat. A bat is hearing through echolocation. It doesn't have eyes, but it's hearing the world. And so who knows what experience arises in a bat's brain as it decodes the sound signals that are coming back to it. But it clearly is probably nothing like what we experience sound to be. So, again, our particular experience of the world is just one that's created by our brains. And because our brains are similar, we sort of agree on it. This color of green doesn't actually go very well with this pink or whatever it is. So we have the same basic sort of response to color as we see it, but it's just as our brains create that particular experience in our consciousness. In a sense, this comes back to saying, it's all in the mind, which, people use in other ways, but basically our experience is all in the mind. It doesn't actually, as we see it, it doesn't actually exist out there. But that's not to say there is no physical world. I mean, I want to make that clear. We'll talk about that a bit more later. There really is, in my opinion, a physical world out there, but it's just not how I see it. And what I'm seeing is, in my mind, is like basically how the consciousness is shaped by our senses of everything. And the essence again there is is consciousness, is that we are conscious, we are aware. That is there all the time. And then the brain is like feeding into our consciousness, excuse me using an noun, but feeding into our mind the data. But the being aware never changes. That's the unchanging aspect of it. The duality is all the different things we experience. But underneath that, the oneness, the essence is being aware. It's a bit like an analogy that's often used, which I think is actually a very useful one. It's like waves on an ocean. When we see an ocean, we see the waves. They're all composed of water. What we see is the waves. We see the activity. The water energy is moving the water into waves, and we see them, and then we take that activity, we see it as a form, or there's ripples, there's circles in the waves, or there's these lines in the waves. We begin to see the forms that are there. It's like the energy is stirring the water, stirring it into different forms, which we see. Underneath, it's all just water. And to take, again, that non-dual parallel, the water isn't changed by becoming a wave. It's all just water. But the stirring of the water, the activity, is what leads to different experiences we have of water, different waves. And I think it's the same thing with the mind. There all these different forms we experience, the tree or whatever it is we're experiencing. We actually think of them as forms. I prefer to think of them as activities arising in consciousness. It's like consciousness is being stirred. Our mind is being stirred by whatever the information is coming through the senses, whatever the brain is doing, the thinking, the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions, whatever it is like stirring the consciousness into this particular multifaceted, three-dimensional surround sound, thinking, feeling experience, which is arising. So, but it's all a stirring that's arising. In what is being stirred, I say, we loosely say consciousness. You could say it's sometimes it's said to be mind stuff. The mind stuff is being stirred. There's the physical world of physical stuff, and then there's mind stuff. In Sanskrit, it's often translated as chitta, which is one of the translations is consciousness. So, but it's that being conscious, that fundamental essence, which is being stirred into this particular experience. And just as the water isn't changed, so our being aware itself, that capacity for awareness, that is not changed. But what is changed is how the forms it takes on, the forms it appears to take on as it becomes active in various ways. And that is where the duality is. And we are never in the same state of mind twice, never. We would fully take it all. And we never even see the same world twice. Everything's always changing in our experience. So it's this real duality there, and there's this real unchanging essence that's there. I say science is seeing this in terms of perception. It's beginning to understand what goes on in the brain when we do see a tree or whatever. But it doesn't really look deeply into what are the real implications of this for reality, our view of reality. And it's not just perception, but everything we know, I say our thoughts, our feelings, but also, science, all our hypotheses, our theories, all of that is actually arising in the mind. A theory is something which we think about, we experience. Or physics, you could say the whole of physics is actually happening in the mind. We do experiments on the world out there, whatever that world is. We do experiments on that. And then the results of those experiments are things we experience. And then the theories we come up with are things we experience. The whole concept of space, time, matter, energy is all taking place in the mind. And I think what we do is we make the mistake of thinking our experience is what is out there. This world I'm experiencing is the world out there, but it's not. There's really two different things here. There's the representation in my mind and whatever reality is. And it's interesting that science doesn't really fully know what that reality is. I mean, when we look at a leaf, coming back to the leaf, we look at the leaf, we look down into it, we see cells, we look down into the cells, we see molecules, we see atoms. And then, as most of you probably aware, when we look into what is an atom, it's 99.999999% empty space. If you imagine an atom expanded to the size of a football pitch, then the nucleus of the atom would be something like the size of a tennis ball in the middle, and the electrons flying around it would be like peas flying around the football stadium. It's nearly all empty space. And then we look at, what is an electron? What is it? We don't know. We have, we say, well, maybe it's a particle, but a particle is just a model derived from our experience of the world. We experience particle. Or maybe it's a wave, because, we experience waves, but clearly it's like it can be both. People I think probably it's neither. It's just they're different ways of modeling what is going on there. In that sense, there is really nothing there. We don't know what is there, but there's no thing there. We think the world is made of things, say electrons, whatever, when we get down to it, or quarks. But they're not actual. When we look at it, there's no things there. All that's there really is information. Well, there's two things. There's information with an electron. There's bits of information, it's mass. We have a number there. It's charge. We have a number. It's spin. We have a number. These different qualities, which is information about something which is not a thing, which we are hypothesizing to be there. We have information. That's not to say electrons, whatever it is, don't exist, but all we know is there is information there. And not only is there information, that information only exists in relationship to everything else or other things. An electron, its mass is only something that's a bit of information that's relative to another something or other which has mass, or its charge is relative to something else which has charge. So there's information, but information only exists in relationship to everything else. And so that is, in a sense, is all we know. And what science is doing when it studies the world is really, science doesn't say what is there. It has nothing to say about what is there. It has a lot to say about the information it gets and how the different parts relate, how they interact. But it doesn't say what the substance is, which is interesting. So the fundamental mistake here, as I mentioned, is we confuse the representation of reality, which arises in our minds. We confuse that with the reality. We think the reality is like what we experience. The reality out there, whatever it is nothing like our experience, absolutely nothing like it. Hard to really assimilate that because we live in the reality of the mind. And that's really important. This representation is like a map of what is out there, which allows us to go out and interact with the world. And that's really absolutely important. And you can say that probably one of the values of being aware is it gives us a representation which we can interact with. And it's so good. It's, high fidelity, three-dimensional, multicolored, feely, touchy. We believe it is the world, but in a sense, we're living in our own self-created virtual reality. That's what we live in, is our own self-created virtual reality, which is so good, we take it to be reality. And then we interact in that, we do things in that virtual reality. We actually do things in the physical, but appear in the virtual reality. And so, when I move my hand, I'm doing something, I'm creating an impulse which does something in the physical, and the representation is so good that it moves the hand to exactly the right place to touch something. So that's what's really going on. And as I say, we confuse the two. But really, we could say all that information out there, whatever it is, the information received by all the different senses is put together into this, this experience I'm having right now, this experience you're having wherever you are, whatever you're seeing, hearing, feeling, touching, thinking. All of this is how that information is, if you like, translated by the brain and how it appears in consciousness. So we could say, this what I'm seeing here is how information is, if you like, translated into experience. I am seeing information stirring, if you like, lighting up consciousness into all these different forms and experiences. So that to me is like, wow, that's the great miracle of all. It's like, this is all the information I'm getting about the world being translated into a conscious experience. And that is wow, how that happens, how the brain does all that, and how it actually then stirs consciousness may ever be the great unanswerable question. How does matter stir consciousness in this way? But what we can begin to see here is a resolution of the two problems. The hard problem of consciousness is how does consciousness arise out of the world of space, time, matter, energy? When you see it this way that I've been proposing, then consciousness doesn't arise out of space, time, matter, energy. It's the opposite. What we consider to be the physical world is actually all that we know of the physical world is an experience in consciousness. It's the consciousness is there already. What we take to be the physical world, what we take to be it, I'm not saying the actual physical world, what we take to be it, our experience of matter, energy, space and time, all our experience of it is all in consciousness. So consciousness does not arise out of the world, the physical world. Our experience of the physical world arises in consciousness. So in that sense, the whole hard problem of consciousness is inside out when we really look at it. And this is I say, is what the science of perception knows, but it doesn't fully get the implications of this. The implications are that consciousness doesn't arise out of the physical. The physical is a representation in consciousness. And then the other problem, the problem with the advaita, the non-dual position, which says, if everything is consciousness, then why don't we see consciousness in everything? That's the challenge there. Why do we see it as a physical world? But it's the same. It's the solution. The resolution is the same thing. Basically, is what we are experiencing is you could say it's a map of what is out there. And as people often say, the map is not the territory, but we mistake the map for the actual physical thing. But the map is the representation, and we mistake that for what is actually out there. But when you look at a map, you might say, where is the paper the map's drawn on? Where is that in the map? It isn't there. The paper the map is drawn on is like the essence of the map. It's the unchanging aspect. You could redraw the map on the paper would still be the same. But then you say, where is the paper in the map? It isn't. It isn't there. But it's the fundamental essence. The most you could probably get is, an arrow pointing to a point in the map that says, you are here. And it's the same with our experience. What we're experiencing is the map of the world. And we say, why don't we see consciousness in the map? The same reason we don't see paper in a physical map, because the whole thing is appearing in consciousness. And so, again, the best we could probably say is a little arrow pointing to ourselves, saying, you are here. You, the experiencer, the subject, you, the being aware, is here underneath the map. The whole map is appearing in that. But it is not the territory. The representation is not reality. This is really, I think, what the advaita position is saying is, underneath all this experience of duality, which is experience in the mind, there is consciousness, there is this basic awareness, but we never actually see consciousness in the world, because the world we see is appearing in consciousness. It's the other way around again. So when you see this, for me, the non-dual position, the advaita position, and the scientific materialist position actually are not in conflict anymore. They're actually two ways of talking about the same thing, but with the fundamental mistake of believing the representation is the reality. And so, coming back to the advaita, what it's saying is, that essence of you, that self, is the self of everything. It's that essence of all we experience. But the most we can point to is just like, you are here. And that's the tat tvam asi. You are here. And more than just an understanding of this, I think what the non-dual, the advaita position is also pointing to is not just understanding that, it's a bit about the fact we should actually know it in our experience, to actually know this reality, that I am always here. I, the experiencer, am always here, the foundation of it all. And I just like to just close with just a very short, just meditative introspection. And you want to do this with the eyes closed or eyes open, it doesn't matter, really. Probably easier with the eyes closed, because we actually take ourselves back a little bit from the physical reality, because vision is our strongest sense, and vision takes the mind out into the world. So that's why meditation is often done eyes closed, but eyes open is okay, whatever you feel like. And just to relax a moment, I often find taking a few deep breaths is really valuable. Just allows me to sort of relax and come back into just being here, noticing my body, noticing the sounds around, just noticing what is my experience in this moment. And there may be feelings that are there. There may be thoughts going through your mind from things I've said, or other thoughts coming in, as they often do, from something about something completely different. Just noticing your experience as it is in the moment. Even if you're having memories of the past or things about the future, it's all just appearing now in this moment. And all these different experiences that you're having in this moment, which you begin to notice. And the attention just wanders around from one to another. You may notice the body, you may notice the breath, you may notice, oh, there's that feeling there, or there's that thought, or whatever it is. What is it that is noticing all of this? And that comes back to the self, the I, not the personal I, the I that has all these qualities and does things and is known in the world, but that ever-present sense of I. The I that is aware of this moment right now. And this is what we really mean by I, and this is what the Advaita teachings are pointing to, is actually beginning to recognize in ourselves this ever unchanging sense of I. Our personal I can change as we grow up, we grow older, we have different thoughts, different values. We're different people, we become different people. In some way, our personal self can change. But this deeper sense of I, never changes. It's unchanging. It's the essence. It's that same sense of I had yesterday, 10 years ago, as a kid. That sense of I, that deeper sense of I, of being the I that is experiencing the world, is the same I have now as the same I that was there as far back as I can remember. That quality of just experiencing, of being aware, that quality of being aware never changes. So that is really what I see non-duality is about. As I say, it's not just everything is one. There is duality. There's this complete diversity of experience. Whatever's going on now in your experience, this is the duality. And as well as duality, and there is a common essence. And that's the bit we don't normally recognize. We're so caught up in our experience of whatever it is in the world, what we're doing, what we're thinking, what we're planning. We don't actually recognize that unchanging essence, which is always there. And that, to me, is the basic message of not just advaita teachings, but so many different teachings in the world, spiritual teachings in one way or another, are saying, know thyself, not to know your personal self, in my case, the Peter Russell author, whatever it is, self, not to know that self, but get to know the I that is experiencing things. That, to me, is really the fundamental essence of all the spiritual teachings in one way or another, is come back to knowing yourself in this way, knowing, getting to recognize this sense of I-ness that's always there. And maybe I'll just be quiet for just a very short while, just to allow you just to actually do that for yourselves, just to notice whatever you're experiencing. Just noticing that quality of I, that which is experiencing all this. And that, to me, is really a fundamental practice we can do, not just in meditation, but any time of the day we think about it. Any time of the day we remind ourselves is just to pause and notice whatever we're experiencing, whatever we're thinking, whatever's going on, and just to recognize, and yes, here I am. I am here experiencing this, just to reconnect with that as often as we can. Just reconnecting with, I am that which is the experiencer of all of this.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much for a fascinating talk there. That was really powerful. To start off with, I'd like to sort of follow up what you were saying about, I suppose, the limitations of the human senses, and this whole idea that if we had a different sensory system, if we had different senses, we would experience a different world.
Yes.
So I think this is really interesting because it's sort of, it makes you think, if our senses are our window onto reality, and all we can see is through that window, is it possible then that we coexist simultaneously with things that are just outside of our conscious awareness, and that maybe whenever someone takes things like a psychedelic or whatever, that they're actually maybe tuning into something that is already there, but our normal everyday state of consciousness is sort of like blocking out, because that is sort of like that's filtering reality just so that we can sort of survive and reproduce almost. Does that make sense?
Yes. And in a way, there's two questions here underneath. Is like, are there aspects of reality we're not aware of? And the answer clearly is yes. I mean, our senses are not only our particular, as you say, window onto the world, our particular representation. They're taking a tiny slice of what is out there. I mean, fish communicate with electrical signals. We're almost totally insensitive to electrical signals, but fish use them a lot. So the world of a fish is it's experiencing its representation, is representing things we know nothing about. And we could have, if we had different senses, we'd have a different reality. So yes, there's so much out there that we don't. We're experiencing this tiny slice of the information that's out there. This tiny slice of the information and creating this experience out of it. The second question is, do psychedelics touch into this? Firstly, I would say many different ways of opening the mind can open us to other information, other experiences, yes. And this can happen with psychedelics. I think it can happen. And we have to be aware that, also what can be happening a lot of the time is experience which are already there in us, which are not normally accessing consciousness, begin to come in. So we maybe have insights or whatever it is, or different views of the world. That can also happen. So I just want to say that, to say taking psychedelics doesn't mean you automatically are connecting with another aspect of the world. A lot of it is connecting with other aspects of our self, our personality, our whatever it is, our ego or non-ego.
Okay, that's very well said. So you've obviously dedicated the best part of your life to raising awareness of this and this understanding. And obviously there's a big why behind that, a big motivation. So I'm just curious to ask, what are the implications of, if this was to become mainstream, if this was to become our default understanding of the nature of reality, what are the implications both on an individual level, but also on a societal level?
Right. Thank you. This is really, really important. You see, nearly all the time, most people are caught up in what I call the personal self, this sense of, the I, Peter Russell self, what I'm doing in the world, et cetera, what I want, what I need, and how I get, my ego self gets, upset by somebody because they did something which wasn't what I expected. We get angry and then we do things, and it drives so much of our activity. And this personal ego self is important. It definitely has a role to play, but we identify with it so much of the time that actually it gets in the way. It creates a lot of unnecessary fear. We do things which aren't really that necessary. The more we get to know this impersonal self, this underlying beingness, this is what I'm saying in that meditation, here I am. The more familiar we get with that, the more we begin to identify with that. We could say identify with our own beingness. The more we do that, the less we are driven by the ego self, the personal self, which means the less we are driven by fear, by anger, or whatever it is, or by wanting things. The ego is always wanting things to be different. The less driven we are by that. And the implications of that is, my life is a lot easier. It's a lot more pleasant because I'm not being disturbed by all these things the ego self gets up to. And I'm going to interact with the world in a different way. I'm going to interact with people in a different way. I'm going to be interacting with you, not from my ego self, but like from my inner being that recognizes, yes, and you have that inner beingness too yourself. So I think it has profound implications for the way we live our own lives and the way we interact with others. And I think the more and more people do that, the better the world becomes. I mean, imagine a world where nobody was acting from fear, unless there was a real reason for fear, but no one was acting from out of fear or judgment or grievance or whatever it was, or fantasies about the future, what it might be. Imagine a world where we lived just true to our recognizing our inner beingness and not driven by the ego mind. Imagine that. It'd be a totally different world. And that's what motivates me really, is how can I share what I've discovered in the hope that it can help other people continue on their path in this way.
Am I right in saying that the deeper we can go internally into our own inner experience and bypass that egoic sort of state of consciousness and that fearful state, the more rooted we are in the world, but also that increases our ability to connect with others and understand others and feel more connected to the world around us.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's often said that, love is the opposite to fear, or fear is the opposite to love. And if we're caught up in fear, and I would suggest that the ego mind, in a way, lives in fear. It lives in fear of the world not being the way it wants, not turning out the way I want it to be, the fear of how other people might see me in negative ways or whatever. The ego mind lives in fear. And so it does not love. The ego mind does not love. It may like certain things for its own well-being. It may, love a person because, that person is, helpful to me in some way. But that's different from what I call lovingness. I think one of the fundamental qualities of our beingness is that it is loving. It is loving. It is compassionate. It is caring. And that's the sort of love which I think we need more of that in the world. I mean, I'm not saying that passionate love, etc., isn't great and wonderful, but what we need more of the world is just that lovingness, whereby we actually begin to appreciate each other and not judge them. And I think fundamental to that also is I recognize that my sense of beingness, the self, that deep sense of I-ness, must be very much like what it is for you, because that deep sense, when I drop into that deep sense, is just, yes, here I am, but not I am with any particular quality. And when you drop into that beingness, you're dropping into that, here I am, but with no particular quality of nearness or whatever. In that sense, I know what it is like to be you deep down. I don't know at all what it's like to be you as a person, what goes on in your mind and your thoughts and your feelings. Maybe I have tiny idea by talking to you, but I do know what it's like for you deep down. And that's where I think compassion comes in, and also kindness. I think we can begin to be kind to each other. We recognize deep down we all want the same thing. Our ego minds are in conflict the whole time. We want different things, and certain people are enemies. But deep down, what we all want is to basically be at peace, to be content. And so how can I, in any interaction with anybody, how can I be in such a way that the other person feels content, at peace as a result of that interaction?
It's so interesting. And what strikes me here is that you would sort of assume that whenever people reach this kind of understanding, that they would just be content and exist in that sort of, that state for the rest of their time here on the planet. But what I've kind of noticed, the people that really get into this, they really want to contribute to the world and reduce suffering in others, and make a big difference in the lives of others as well. So I think there's something there. Now I'm going to just ask a question from Sky Nelson Isaacs here on Sky's behalf. So he says, thanks, Peter. To continue on an earlier theme, what connection do you see between the personal journey of learning about the representation of reality in our minds and the actual work that still needs doing in the world, like working for social or environmental justice?
Yes, absolutely. This is really important. And we are drawn to act in the world. And we see injustices everywhere. And it doesn't mean to say, just because I know my inner essence, I just ignore all that. I ignore the world. It's like, no, we are now in a more powerful position to actually see what's needed. So rather than coming out, against some social injustice, coming out of anger or fear or whatever it is, or judgment about things, the more free we are of that, the more we can actually allow our inner knowing, our inner wisdom to come through and decide, okay, how can I best help this situation? But I think we can best help the situation coming from a place of inner stability and compassion and caring, rather than coming out of the ego mind. So absolutely, I would say it becomes even more important because we're not so distracted by what our individual personal self wants to get in the world. We are much freer to see what is the most appropriate action I can do here that will really help other people, help the world. So yes, that is more important than ever, becomes more important than ever. That's what we are now free to begin to focus on, rather than focusing on what our little personal self wants. We're much freer to focusing on how can I best help the world.
That requires discernment between figuring out what's your small self egoic desires and what maybe the bigger self wants to sort of maybe create through you or bring into the world through you. So how can someone discern between those two things?
I think to begin with, to discern between them, one needs to actually begin to know what I was talking about. This is the fundamental thing, know thyself. The more familiar we can get with that quality of just beingness, the being aware, the more familiar we are with that, the more we can discern between whether we're in that mode or in the ego mode. And things that are very useful for discerning that when we're caught up in the personal ego mode, there's nearly always a sense of slight tension in the mind. There's a focusing, there's a wanting, or whatever it is. When we recognize that, we can recognize, I'm caught up in something here. I'm caught up in it. Let me pause and let me come back to recognizing the other side. It's going to keep on coming in. I mean, I know for some people it may, there's this moment of enlightenment satori where everything disappears and they just know the self and that's it forever after. I think for most of us, it's a continual process of like coming back. Yes. So we gradually become more and more familiar with that beingness, and the power of the ego mind begins to drop away. But it's recognizing it. We recognize, when I'm caught in it, another thing is when it's telling us to do something, when there's an urgency to do something. That's another thing I recognize is actually the ego mind is always feeling things are urgent, whereas our beingness is more relaxed. It's much more relaxed. But that is part of, I think that's part of the journey as well, is discerning them. But I say you've got to begin to know the inner self in order to discern between the two, and then let go of it. I mean, another way I recognize it, the ego mind is nearly always thinking about something, what we've got to do, what's wrong, what I want, etc. The pure being self isn't caught up in thoughts about what it notices the thoughts, but it's not so caught up in the thoughts. And so another thing which is very useful is whenever I notice myself getting caught up in some string of thought, thinking, this is probably the ego mind. Let me just pause the thinking for a moment, step out of that thinking, and just come back to, here I am.
Now, before we wrap up, just before we had we started the webinar today, we talked about, the work that you've been doing and the sort of mission you've been on for most of your life. If you don't mind, would you mind sharing that with the rest of the attendees here, the mission that you're on, and if there's any way at all that they can support you in doing that work? I think that'd be really cool to end on.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, my mission, it's been my mission for years, really is to distill the essential wisdom of all the world's spiritual traditions. I think they're all talking about the same thing. They may appear very, very different on the surface, but my mission has been to look deep. What is the common essence of all the world's spiritual traditions, and bring it down to its simplest essence, and then share that as I can with other people in the world, just because I think it's important. And so I, like to share what I've discovered, as I've been doing in this webinar here, sharing my insights, experiences, whatever, share that with other people as widely as possible. So what other people can do to help me is share what they've, learned from me. And I've got my website, which is full of videos and articles and recordings and lots of different things and meditations. I mean, take people to my website, and there you can get a really much broader introduction to what I feel, see in the world, and my thoughts, and share that more widely so that, I can reach some of you here now, but, to put this out more widely to other people, that would be the greatest help.
And so you've read a number of books. Where would be the best place for people to start, would you recommend, in the books that you've written? 2
places. My latest book, Letting Go of Nothing, is really my take on what the essence of the spiritual work is about, but bringing it right down to, again, very simple everyday languages. So in terms of that, the self-awareness side, letting go of nothing, more on the science and consciousness side, I would say my previous book, From Science to God, which is about my own journey from being a scientist to actually beginning to see the spiritual in the world. And that's much more about, in a sense, more about what we've been talking about today, From Science to God.
Just want to say before you do, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to share some of your knowledge and wisdom with us today. I really appreciate it. And there's something incredibly real about what you're doing. So just keep going. And I wish you all the best going forward. All right.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Yeah, really enjoyed it.